So hi, I'm Richard Bennett. As it says on the board, I work for Avaya. I actually have the best job in Avaya because as the CTO team and working what we do in terms of technology, there's a lot of stuff happens in the field. There's a lot of things that come out of the company in terms of contact center, UC, data, video, collab, etc. But our job really is much more about looking at what happens in the real world, what happens in the future trends, and how do we start bringing that back towards what products need to feel like, what solutions need to feel like, so that when the customers get in front of that, they really see the types of value you were just hearing about. It was interesting because one of the questions that resonated from the panel session was very much with unlimited resource and unlimited time, what's the perfect collaboration application? Certainly, there's no one vendor in that answer. In fact, part of what I want to talk about today really is the idea that to deliver that perfect collaboration application, you actually need to start thinking about what's the best of breed solution and how do you ensure federation in between that. It's also important to realize that the world has changed. In fact, I used to do all my presentations in PowerPoint. I don't do that now. In fact, typically when I think about how we've moved and evolved, this is a technology called Prezi. I'm sure some of you should be familiar with it. Certainly it adds a much greater flair when you've got these type of backdrops. I actually like the idea that it enables me to tell you a story, which isn't necessarily a story about Avaya per se. It's actually a story about how that world that we're all in has altered. I spent a huge amount of time with CTOs around the world. In fact, the 5 big trends that we tend to talk about, now kind of the analysts are starting to admit that we're starting to feel this move away from what is a product. What is a phone is no longer relevant. What is a contact center agent is no longer relevant. It's all about how does it fit into 2 fields. Field number 1 is this understanding around communication or collaboration-enabled business process. And field number 2 is very much around something much more important. It's around this idea of business transformation. When I go to customers and have a conversation about ROI or TCO or how we can change the way that they do business, it's certainly interesting. Certainly we have some elements of a portfolio that enable that. Certainly we interact with things like Microsoft and Google and deliver future opportunities on how we can change the way that people work. But the real key to this, and in my experience, I suppose, over the last, 20, 25 years in communications, starting with the humble cable-connected copper twists for phones and all the way through to today, is that you can't force change. You can certainly lead the horse to the trough, and the trough may be an ultra see-through, self-cleaning, algae-reducing trough, but at the end of the day, the horse has to make that decision to drink from this super purified water. So it doesn't really matter if the trend is very much around this idea of big data and analytics. Certainly, the companies that we talk to and the businesses I speak to are very clear that for them, big data is not something that exists just in a contact center space. It's information that they want to use to change the way that people are working in their business. And it's not just about letting the user make the choice about that change. Part of what we heard earlier in the panel is that presence is presence, and in actuality, the value of presence is limited. But when you start adding things like rich presence into a conversation, the autonomy about changing how interaction occurs between individuals, this idea that, yeah, the lowest common denominator may even be SMS, in fact. But in fact, it's important to recognize what types of individuals prefer what types of communication. You need analytics. And part of that analytics is using big data over the next 2 to 3 years to build up this idea of a very important word called context. Context then leads us neatly into this idea around mobility and BYOD. It's a huge phrase, bring your own device, bring your own applications. And this is now where we get to the root of what I want to talk about today, which is federation. This idea that you can have one application is very interesting. Bring your own app, in fact, is probably much more important to businesses today that we speak to over and above bring your own device. Because the bring your own app conversation is very much around a user experience. I think there was a really good point made earlier where we were talking about the 2-year-old that innately understands FaceTime. I actually have some good friends of mine. They have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old. Yeah, the 1-year-old's not quite there yet with the catching the ball through the iPad, but the 3-year-old is there with selecting front or back camera on the iPad to show mummy and daddy what's going on at the grandparents' house where they've been left for the weekend so their parents can have a nice weekend with some wine and some buffet down in central London at my house. And this idea that that adoption is the key driver hasn't actually changed since I was working with Cisco back in 97, 98, and we were looking at the idea of just an IP phone. And adoption really then drives this idea that bring your own device and mobile working is not going to be something, again, that you can lead someone into. They have to naturally take that. And when they take it, they have to understand that if they are sitting at their desk and they are using a certain device or application, that when they step away from that desk, you can't deprecate the features and the functionality. When you do deprecate the features and functionality, you eliminate immediately the adoption. And this is now where we start to think about what are the drivers for companies to invest in technology. Because in my mind, mobility is a very powerful tool. I've been using my laptop over here for the first time in God knows how long, and in fact, that's my work Lenovo, which I hate with an absolute passion. I have a MacBook Air, which is currently with the geniuses in London. They're trying to work out why it won't load the screen. Otherwise, I'd be here on my MacBook Air. I don't have an iPhone. I hate the iPhone. Singularly, when I tried it several years ago, it's certainly the best piece of technology I'd ever used. The screen was divine, and the App Store was a perfect way to consume and spend a huge amount of money by accident, by the way. But then when I dropped it in a snowdrift, and of course I had the white iPhone because that was decidedly cooler, snow, white iPhone, well, you get the point. And I went back and said to my service provider, guys, I don't want an iPhone because whilst it's a brilliant device, it's singularly the worst telephone I've ever used. In fact, in my bag I had the iPhone, and still to this day, there's a Nokia 6110 living in my knapsack, the phone that will literally never die, and I think I charged it at some point last January, and still today I know I can turn it on. And this is the idea of user experience across multiple devices, because I wanted a phone, and I also wanted that experience of an iPhone. Fast forward a couple of years to today, and in fact, on the table in front is the new HTC One. It's really Android, which I find more flexible than iOS. It's actually got a battery life to it, which I find also more flexible than iOS. Certainly iOS 7, which is currently taking my iPad to pieces. Again, that's going back to the Genius Store when I get back to the UK. And so the idea that mobility drives based on expectation, the idea that my user experience as a user is important to me, means that as we even think about some of the other trends, in fact, talking about things like how are we integrating with social media, I know a lot of this has been covered today, so I won't recap it. Even talking about what happens if you see negative feedback in the real world about your business in social media, how are you capturing it? In my view, social is a very, very important part of how we integrate this idea of federated information. If someone starts bad-mouthing a company, yeah, do you know what? Maybe it's not relevant. But if I start saying very deflammatory things or inflammatory things about my service provider, well, I'm followed by most of the vendors in this room. I'm followed by all of the service providers in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And suddenly if I'm saying, hey guys, on my tweet, at Vodafone UK, I'm not happy with my replacement phone, you've sent me another iPhone, I definitely wanted Android. If they spot that and don't act on it, when I've also said, at O2, at Orange, at EE, at T-Mobile, can you beat my deal? Then they're losing a customer they've had for nearly 7 or 8 years. So social media is actually really about context. And it has to be integrated when we start thinking about user experience. But it also has to be integrated into the corporate strategies of business. Moving away from this idea, it's business process, social drives business transformation. In fact, one of the most interesting parts of it is that we see a lot of companies now are moving away from this John, who works in marketing, keeps an eye on Twitter, and they're trying to work out how do they get that social feed as part of their big data. Now, how do they do that? How do they also leave this Twitter thing with a very clear view of what security needs to feel like? This, again, is a huge part of this bring your own device strategy. The ultimate collaboration platform certainly shouldn't be sitting behind a VPN. I know I went home at Christmas last year and explained to my mother how Avaya Flare works. It's one of our mobile applications on multiple devices. And I explained to her I could make phone calls pretty much from anywhere. And then I went to Santa Clara sometime shortly after Christmas. And I was down at we've got an office there, and it was great. A couple of meetings, met with the BUs, some of my US teams. And I flew from Santa Clara to New York. And I love planes for 2 very important reasons. Firstly, I don't watch a lot of movies, so it's a good chance to catch up on movies. But secondly, it's really nice, quiet time. There's no email, there's no phones, there's no text messages. I'm a killer for text, by the way. I love it over most other applications that I use. There's nothing. And then I sat on this plane and I noticed that across the aisle from me, one of the individuals was using Facebook. And I thought, that's new. I didn't know you could get offline Facebook. That's pretty cool. Cache a few pages, catch up on the day's feed. And then she refreshed the page. And then she moved again to a different page. And then she was trying to send instant messages to the people on Facebook. And I'm thinking, okay, I have not been on a plane yet with Wi-Fi, but if this has got Wi-Fi, I'm going to get pretty excited. So usual thing, fired up the iPad, went into the settings. Yep, sure enough, there it is. American Airlines have got the Wi-Fi now. I'm like, okay, so I connect to the Wi-Fi. I fire up my iPad, and we don't have VPN technology now. We have SBCs and identity engines, a core part of what you need if you're going to deliver applications on mobile devices. Up it comes, over the network, my presence goes live, my context presence goes live. I'll talk about context in a second. My PA sees that I'm online. Immediately a call comes in, and I'm like, wow, okay, so I've got my headset out. Guy next to me is starting to look a little bit concerned, but that's okay, I can live with that. I'm like, hi, Regina, how are you? She's like, have you forgotten to do this? I'm like, yes, inevitably. That's why you're calling me. And she went, okay, no worries. Have you got video? And I was like, no, I'm on a plane. That seems unlikely. And she went, oh, I'll call you back when you land. I was like, no, I'm actually in the air on a plane. And so she hit the video button, and yeah, it was jumpy, and yeah, it was hard to see her, and yeah, it was a bit grainy. But the connectivity was there based on the fact that I didn't have to log into anything, it just worked. I actually went through the cloud and into some of the core services that we have that sit in the cloud. But the idea being now, in sadness, I have lost my quiet time on the plane. But in happiness, we did prove this idea that work anywhere is now a real reality. And the next question has to become, how long before they put the equivalent of a train quiet carriage on the plane? So my view then, when I think about the 5 drivers of the world, is very much around, these are all big, important technology statements, and they're big, huge elements of what businesses are investing in, but it doesn't answer 2 points. Firstly, how is it changing user adoption? And B, what's the idea of need? Because in the next year, mobility is absolutely going to be adopted by over 52% of the companies out there in the world. That's not just ours. That's people that work with Polycom, Video, Cisco, anyone, right? Mobility becomes that core driver as we consume data and try and work more effectively. I don't just text. I don't just email. I don't just use IM. Certainly, presence for me is irrelevant if it's not rich presence. And notably, I only use video if it's someone I really know or like. And it's certainly not something that I consume with strangers very often. I really greatly prefer a face-to-face meeting, first time out, and then video seems fine to me. But that's my personal adoption criteria. And in fact, if I think about that personal adoption criteria, it's really now about where's the need. We heard earlier that, in fact, a lot of the early part of that debate that we listened to, how do you use email? Is it going to be video? When do you use IM and presence? Actually, the word there is context. And context, if it's manual, is as bad as IM and presence as it was now today. I'll give you an example. One of my colleagues, we use our own internal IM and presence system, but one of my colleagues works externally from us and a business partner, and they have Link. And his status is a manual status, and it says, going to Crete, back in 2 weeks. Now, I know for a fact he went to Crete at the very, very end of May this year. And still today, that presence says, gone to Crete, away for 2 weeks, with a little green light above it. Now, if you then think about IM and presence in the real world, you think about what it looks like. Last year, the top 2 IM messages that were sent on any platform, all combined, all brought together. The first one, are you there? Which seems a little redundant. And the second one, can you talk? Which also seems a little bit redundant if you have presence. What was never sent, in fact, was the idea of how can you talk? Would you like to have a video call? Because those are all manual processes. If you take an idea of context and big data together, I can analyze the way that I normally interact with certain people, and I can naturally promote that as the de facto minimum base standard that I want to communicate at. But what if I'm remote? What if, like today, I'm sitting in a room, I don't have the Wi-Fi access code, so I'm over my 4G or currently 3G mobile as a hotspot. I don't want to run video over my iPad on that one. So I want the system to automatically deprecate down a level and reach the common denominator for the location and also the availability of bandwidth that I'm in. I think about this idea as context because it has to be autonomous. And if you can drive autonomous interaction where it changes the level, then you take it off the hands of the user and you accidentally drive adoption. There were some great studies done by Forrester and as part of a network intervention we did last year, 2 really big companies, you would know them if I told you, and we looked at how they were using the technology without context. And we implemented context where it autonomously took what types of interaction people are trying to achieve, and then we looked at whether those interactions were internal or beyond the boundaries of the business. And we made it so that those feeds and those speeds were automatically assessed and addressed, and the right communication was implemented. Fundamentally changed the way they work, and they haven't gone back to the standard versions of presence. But that presents one very important problem. Because that's all very well and good if it's a single vendor that runs the entire world. It's all very well and good if everyone in the room has got an Avaya solution, but you don't. No one does. In the world, for example, it's very important to realize that the single vendor went away in 2001, 2002 at the very latest, maybe even before that. So the question has to be, in the world of the ideal collaboration application, how are we building those bridges between disparate vendors without deprecating that user experience I've talked about? Whether or not it's the right time and the right place and all these other things is pretty much very key to that. But the idea that federation takes a user experience and guarantees it across any platform is key. So in the end then, federation has to be about more than just what is the solution. It has to be, does that solution work on every part of your platform portfolio? That's business process. But the next piece has to be, can you federate that functionality to people outside your organization? If I want to drive in you new customer behavior, if I want to retain you as a customer of my organization, and I produce the ability for you to use an app, but I say, hey guys, you can only use it on iOS, well, firstly, that's a foolish choice. Been that Android outsold them for the last 2 quarters. But secondarily, I've literally halved my available market for this new way that I want you, my customer, to interact with me, the business. In fact, for those of you that are familiar with gaming, Grand Theft Auto 5, biggest selling game of all time, huge furore over its capabilities, enormous companion applications, no support for Android in a core part of that game. Huge social uproar, by the way, very clearly noticed by Rockstar, the game producer, and easily responded to because they had that social strategy. But they didn't federate their companion application so it could work interactively across multiple platforms. The same goes if you have OS, Mac OS, or if you have Windows. Why should you be able to interact with me, your service provider, differently just because you're on different technology? So I suggest that when we think about then building a corporate strategy, when we think about this idea of what is it in terms of innovation, what is it in terms of supporting change, what does it mean in terms of depth of innovation, and how do you move between these 3 separate standards for innovation, the 2 important words here, what is the context of interaction, and secondarily, how do you federate that across the existing CapEx in that customer? What if they have existing investments? How do you bring those into this? And secondarily, how do you make sure you don't lose that feature and functionality? In the end, then, it's about understanding the route through the network of individuals, understanding these preferences, and understanding that in the end, the business solutions are not going to be wholly one vendor. For us, sure, stack on stack, everything can be delivered end to end. In the real world, no. Sorry, but in my mind, it's whether or not you have an enterprise class solution. It's whether or not that consists of separate applications and services end to end. Open collaboration for a mobile enterprise is not about having just an Avaya Flare, just a Scopia, just a WebEx, just a Link client. It's about what do they all do together to reach that level of common denomination. It's about thinking that, in my mind, if I want users to adopt this technology, I remember that my mum still uses VHS. My younger sister, who's 25, never phones me ever. Where in between those 2 can I build that bridge? How much of that is non-real time? How much of it is real time? How do you optimize those questions, and how do you deliver a solution that's not just fixed today, but is actually open enough that when the next big thing comes, it can also be integrated. Is SIP the answer to that question? Maybe. Is WebRTC the answer to that question? Maybe. Is the next thing the answer to that question? Also maybe. But the idea that flexibility is key and proof it works has to be around what is the customer experience? Are businesses going to invest in that experience now? No. Economic climate as is? Probably not. But if I deliver an OpEx model where I can augment these types of services and solutions on top of an existing CapEx, well then now I have two questions. Does this deliver the business value? And secondarily, does it integrate with that core investment? So to my mind, cloud is definitely there. Hosted cloud is about what are the edge applications integrated with that core? Where are the dotted lines between these vendors? Who supports those dotted lines, by the way? That's another major challenge when we look at risk inside the businesses. And then finally, to leave you with just a thought, when I talk to most customers about future interactions, this is where the challenge now becomes, because no one really knows what the next big thing is. No one really knows how we're going to drive that. I've got to say, I love the Zula app. That really turned me on. I just sent that to my team and said, you guys need to see this, understand it. This looks like a really cool tool. But then I think about, well, how does that integrate with my business applications? Can I federate the information between that and my core network? Can I look at interaction in there that then can be supported across multiple platforms? You get a yes to that question, and suddenly you've got a mobile app that integrates and drives business value. So where is that collaboration? How is it delivered? Is it augmented cloud, which sits on top of cloud or sits on top of enterprise? Is it then going to be fully secure, getting past some of these questions of cloud? And finally, is it something that you embed within business process? Because for me, embedding these types of tools inside a process, filling the holes in the Swiss cheese that is end-to-end, is the value of all the things on that board up there and all the separate little applications that everyone sees appearing and disappearing every day of the week, every week of the month, every month of the year. And so that journey that we go on then, and it's a journey that's certainly not one that only Avaya are taking, it's a customer journey. It's all about how do we provide optimization in a real-time way to deliver this evolution where the user naturally moves forward, naturally picks up that user experience, where they demand more from you so you can then start saying, well, end-to-end, whether it's virtualized or not, I'm now meeting the pieces that you need. I'm finishing off with this idea that it's open, future-proofed. I have secured it end-to-end. I have moved it through this idea that it's our choice from a customer deployment in multi-vendor world. And finally, as I think about, is it the preferred choice? Doesn't matter because it's the customer choice. Is it available today, or is it something I do tomorrow? And that means one last question. And it's a question I'll leave you with, which is simply put, if I'm a user today, will I be able to use that technology of tomorrow? And if I can't, who will? And if it's the younger generation of today, aren't they the people that we should ask what they want from collaboration if it was a perfect collaboration world? Thanks for the time.